Good morning, folks. This is Rachel Wilkins here, joining you for Coffee with Artists. We are live right now on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. We're still just testing out Instagram, so we do have a little bit of feedback here from me. Let's see if we can fix that. 1 second. Bear with us, folks. I'm going to pop this on silent. You have some feedback there as well, Kay? Let's see if we can make this work. And now my dog's barking, of course. All right. I think we got this. All right. So we are live this morning. Coffee with Artists. Welcome, folks. Glad to have you here. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by an interdisciplinary artist, Kiayani Douglas. Kay's work addresses race, history, and privilege. Kay, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
And thank you for jumping in and experimenting with this Instagram with me, because we have not done this before. So
I've never done this before, so we're in it together.
We're going to see how it goes. So tell us a little bit about growing up as an artist, growing up in general. You grew up in Connecticut.
Uh-huh.
Tell us about that experience.
I grew up in Connecticut, so I was born and raised. I went to public schools, and honestly, my first memory of art making wasn't until the 5th grade. I still have my work from the 5th grade that I made, and it's interesting to see the parallels from then and now. But I've always liked art. I've always been the most creative cousin, and I've always done things artistically, but I never realized my own talents until I was in the 5th grade, and I saw other artists working in the classroom setting that I had. So yeah, I've always liked art, and I've always liked different kinds of art as well.
Was there anybody perhaps in those, some people are saying there's an echo here. Let me just see if I move this. Let's try this. We got to get this right. This is our first.
Better?
I think it might have been me. Let's see. Yep, definitely me. Hold on. All right, folks, bear with us. We're giving this a try. We're gonna make it work. If it doesn't work, you know what? Yeah, I don't think it's okay. All right, we're gonna jump off Instagram, but if anybody wants to watch, please jump over to Facebook or YouTube, and we will be live over there. Thanks, folks.
Bye.
All right, we tried it. It didn't work, but that's all right. It's all about experimenting. So was there anyone in those early days that really kind of championed you or gave you the support that kind of nurtured that creativity in you?
Well, for sure, my mother. She would have sent me to clown school if that was going to be my choice, and she would have made sure I went to the best clown school ever. So for sure, my mother. I remember I was having troubles in school, and they were trying to figure it out, and they brought me to a psychologist, and they're like, "What's wrong with my daughter? She's doing really bad," and they pretty much said, find something she's interested in, and make sure you hone on that, and you make sure everything in life is surrounded by that one thing that she's interested in. And she definitely did that. And here I am now.
That's incredible. Is your mom a creative person herself?
No, not at all. My father is the creative. He sings, he writes, but my father and I don't really have a relationship, and we're not really that close. So my mother, she's not creative at all. She always asks me, that's kind of a lie. She is a little bit creative, but I'm definitely the creative that she comes to when she has advice, or if she wants something made or something, for sure.
That's awesome. You talked about your father in a recent interview. You said that you had kind of this conventional art education when you went to do your BFA, but it was your father that introduced you to Kiayani Douglas, who is no relation, but
right, no relation. Maybe we do, but as of now, we don't.
Tell us a little bit about that. Kiayani Douglas was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. Tell us about that, experiencing his work, his graphic designs. How did that impact you on your journey?
So I didn't learn. So growing up, I would hear from my father about the Black Panther Party, and I wasn't interested because it didn't align what I was learning in school. And so immediately I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't want to hear it. And so as I went through high school and my undergrad, where I focused on ceramics for my undergrad. As I went to master's, where I was an interdisciplinary master's program, I started thinking about those parallels of things that we learn traditionally from our parents, and things that we learn in school, and how those sometimes contradict itself, and how they sometimes don't really coexist or work together in the ways that we assume that they would. And so trying to figure out what I wanted to do for my thesis, I was like in a mess. I didn't know what kind of art I wanted to create. Honestly, the work that I won for Conceptions is the work that came out of my master's program. I never made work like that prior to that. And so I didn't hear about Emory Douglas. Although I knew about the Black Panther Party, I didn't hear about Emory Douglas until I was getting my MFA, doing research. And so when I found out about him, I was like, this is what my life has been missing. One, that representation for me. And then two, I'm just looking through all the propaganda and all of the posters that he made during those times. And I'm like, it's so relevant to what we're going through today and what's needed and what kind of advocacies are needed today. And so, in that moment, I was like, well, I need a thesis, and this is something I'm really passionate about. How can I figure out a way of making a huge body of work that honors the Black Panther program's 10-point program? And so I just had a solo show that kind of previewed all of those series, those 10 different series in that work. And so I only know about Emory Douglas for the past 4 years, and I've been kind of obsessed, rightfully so. But yeah, that was kind of my journey of figuring that out and how that connected to my father.
So you talked about, several of the issues that were prevalent at that time are still issues that are prevalent today. And we're talking, some 40 years later. You think about police brutality, mass incarceration. What responsibility do you think that the artist plays in bringing those issues to the surface and presenting them to the public?
I feel like in culture, in our society, sometimes we don't understand that responsibility that artists have. We feel like we just need to make visual things that are visually pleasing. But personally, I think for all creatives, whether that be a cook, whether that be a poet, whether that be a writer, an artist, a sculptor, it's our responsibility to kind of look and evaluate at our culture and show people through a different lens how that works or how that's not working. I feel like in a society, we kind of get hung up on just the things that are just perpetuated to us and like just shoved in our faces all the time. And we don't really realize those underlying things that make those things okay. And so for me, I took up the responsibility to create work around social justice narratives. Not to say people aren't, because there's a lot of great artists who are, but I feel like in the emerging artists world, it's kind of like, where are those artists that are talking about social change and using their platform, not to make money necessarily, but to educate people about what is going on and what's needed for change?
And you struck on a really interesting point there. The difference as an artist between making money and making a statement or being heard and being seen versus being valued financially. That's always kind of a balance I think we struggle with as creative people. How do you reckon with that? I mean, obviously you're an educator, so you do have a little bit of a platform where you can share your voice, but how do you reckon with that as an emerging artist who maybe is not afforded the same opportunities as artists who are more established, who are making similar kind of work? How do you deal with that?
So for me, it's for a really long time, even before Conceptions, I was like, I'm never paying for an artist anything to apply for. It makes no sense. I was really strong about it. But then I came across Conceptions and your platform, and I was like, this is really interesting. I can get my message out to more people than I would have ever been able to just in my house or in Connecticut. And I'm able to see my own worth and my own value in a way. And so although personally, I don't monetize off of my work, I don't sell work, and I don't go through the mission of actually selling works. I give away a lot of work, give away a lot of prints actually to people, because I'm really interested in people engaging into that conversation as opposed to feeling forced that they have to come into the conversation because there's money involved. I feel like I'm circling around your question, so I'm going to ask you to just.
That's all right. No, because I think there's a lot to unpack in what you said. It's interesting what you said about having the platform to be able to be in front of those people and wanting to experience the work. But I had no idea you don't actually sell your work either.
I've sold a couple of pieces. I'm sorry?
Was it a conscious decision or something that kind of came out of the
Yeah, it was a conscious decision because I've sold a couple of pieces and I've done commissions and things, which I do like and I actually do enjoy. But for me, it's like it was like that tie of like, should I be making money off of this? Or should I be using this as a way to educate people? And so I am an educator and I do teach full time. And so that's kind of where my heart is. It's like, I'm a teacher. And so I want to teach people things as opposed to taxing people and telling them, hey, you have to pay me X amount of money in order for you, because I'm an artist and because I have that special skill, in order for you to get into my head. I've come across that because it's just more personal. We were asking our undergrad program, like, would you like to be known? Or would you like your work to be recognized? And for me, I've always want my work to be recognized. Who cares if it was by me? That's my personal opinion. I'm like, and that's why I give out a lot of free prints, because it's not about me. It's about the work that needs to be done and the work that in many ways have been forgotten. And I feel like I'm extremely grateful that I do have a job to support my creative outlet. And so with that being said, I've been in moments where I didn't have a job to support that, where I was selling my work to help support. But I've dialed back because I am in a really privileged place now where I've been able to dial back to say, no, I don't have to sell my work. I'm more interested in creating programming for people to understand what the work is about and how they can engage in conversation, for sure.
Let's talk about that, because at the conception show, you obviously won the award for excellence, which congratulations. It was very well deserved. And at the show, one of our jurors, who is a regular juror, Sarah Linda Lichtenblau, she is the assistant, I think, programming director at the.
I think assistant director of education, I think, or
that's
something around that realm.
At the Hudson River Museum up in New York, and she invited you to come and teach a class. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yes, that experience, honestly, has been the best experience for me. For the first time in my career, I've had interest from a museum that's interested in, as simple as my programming, and my art, obviously, but definitely my programming. And that's, as an artist, that's where I live within the programming. The artwork is more of the thing to entice people to get interested into the programming. But as an artist, I feel like I'm a performative artist in the sense where it's we're more so about the programming that can be created and bringing community together. But that, I just came back in February from the Hudson River Museum. So that was my second time going to the museum and doing a workshop. And both workshops were awesome and they were very different. But I love being a part of that museum community because it's very, very different from your arts community, your typical arts community. Having my BFA and my MFA, I get the community a little bit more. And so that's kind of the community that I want to infiltrate, especially with the kind of work that I'm doing.
How was it received, the workshops, each of them? You said they were very different.
Yeah, so they're around the same. So the first workshop, I taught them how to make my patterns that I make in a very simple way with recycled materials. And that was mostly with kids. And that was hard because the kids didn't want to leave because they were having so much fun. They were so engaged, but it was supposed to be a drop-in kind of activity. And the kids were like, can I please just finish this? Because it's a little meditative too, in a sense, what I do as far as my work. And then the other workshop that I just had last month for it's almost May. Last month for Black History Month was rooted around just leaders in Black history. And so I printed my own patterns that I brought for the paper, and then I showed them how to make prints, again, out of recycled material of portraits that they then screen printed on either a pattern that they made, because we had a little bit more time, or mostly on the patterns that I provided for them. And that that one was my favorite one and I feel like the most successful, because that one wasn't a drop-in. It was more like I had about 30 people just waiting to learn like a technique. We had a full house, and they were all adults. There was a couple of kids, which was nice, but it was nice changing from kids to adults, because I teach high school all day, every day. And sometimes it's nice to just have like adult kind of connections, and you'll see those connections are very similar sometimes between adults and kids, especially when they're learning something or a new skill. So those experiences were awesome. And I always say without conceptions, that wouldn't be an experience that I don't think I would have been able to get at that time. And it's like the universe kind of aligning itself with conceptions and me finding conceptions. So I'm forever grateful for the opportunity, for sure.
Well, we were just thrilled that it happened. It's always good to we're kind of like the middlemen. We're just there to elevate you guys and bring in people to hopefully connect the dots. So we're always happy when it actually comes to fruition, and you come out of the other side of it with a great experience. You talked about children there. How do you maintain, or do you even have an element of play in your work when you're addressing such heavy topics?
Can you define play for me? What do you mean by play a little bit more?
I guess when for me as an artist, like there's an element of joy and playfulness, and that creativity is playful for me. And I think there's other artists that would maybe relate to that, maybe not. Is it something that you have joy in when you're creating it?
When I'm creating my work? Yeah. It's interesting because I do find a lot of joy in creating my work, even though some of my narratives are somewhat morbid. I like the No More hashtag series, where I create these portraits of people who died from police brutality, but I try to flip the portraits in a way where even out of context, they just look like these really nice batik-inspired portraits, similar to the portraits you kind of see behind me. But once you look a little closer, you really get to see the heaviness of what that really means. So I do entertain play a little bit in my work. I think it's more subconscious than anything, but it is a trending thing through all of my things. There is some kind of moments where play can happen or does happen, whether it be in my programming. But honestly, it's not intentional. The outcome of it is intentional, if that makes sense, but like the act of doing it is not intentional. So I'm interested in seeing people from a distance experiencing that play, as opposed to me being the person that's introducing them to that idea of play with my work. But for me, it's a way of meditating, honestly, really frankly. Like with all these heavy social issues, I'm like, well, at least I can make one picture that kind of says how I'm feeling about this issue, or the position I stand behind this issue. But at the end of the day, in a world that's so heavy, and in a society that has so much news and so many different levels of like, listen to me, I'm important, this narrative is important, it's a way of self-care for me personally, just to make the work. And then I'm hoping that it becomes that for others as they investigate and play with the work as well.
So you talked about the 13 Amendments, which was phenomenal documentary by Ava DuVernay, that impacted you creatively and led you to create these portraits of unarmed Black victims that were the victims of police brutality. Tell us about that process and what creating that series meant to you.
So I was, and this was in 2017. I will never remember this time because I was really struggling in my master's program, because I started my master's program in the fall of 2016. And by January, it was like, okay, what are you doing with your life? What kind of art you're making? And I was still trying to figure it out. And a lot of it is because I didn't have a breadth of Black history. Or understanding of Black history or knowledge of Black history. And so around that time in January, I had a really bad critique. I had all these ideas in my head, and they were like, that's all you had to bring to us? And I'm just like, yes. And so that really pushed me to like think about like, how can I make more work, and how can I be more responsive to things and make more call to actions and more work a little bit more quicker without overly conceptualizing it. And so I watched Ava DuVernay's 13th Amendment, And I was just blown away about all of the with all of the knowledge that she curated for that documentary. And I look at it as a fellow artist. I get inspired by fellow artists all the time. And so, like, as a fellow artist, I'm just like, she really had a way for us to rethink about what that really meant for us, people of color, the world, the socially, how we interact with each other. And I just thought that was really interesting. But what really stuck out to me most was the mass incarceration narrative and police brutality. And so I stumbled across a whole bunch of different, it was kind of like a rabbit hole. I saw the 13th Amendment. I was like, what other movies and documentaries can I see? And I stumbled across a resource actually through doing research, killedbypolice.net. And it's a website completely dedicated to people who've been killed by police, whether that was warranted or whether it wasn't warranted. It was just like a database, a very transparent database of people who've been killed by police. And they've been doing this for the past, I want to say 5-6 years with no funding. And so I saw the website and I was like, oh my goodness, like, and they have all the news articles for every person. And so I started doing my own curating of those people who were killed by police. And I was like, who was unarmed? If they were armed, what did they have in comparison to a gun? And so I started taking those people out. And so that's where I got the inspiration to really start making those portraits. But then I realized, not then, but in the same time, I realized there's other people doing this work. Like killedbypolice.net was someone who decided to do this work with no pay, just because they're passionate about it. Curate all of these resources. That means articles, that means pictures of the deceased, that means obituaries, that means how they were killed, what race they were. Like, this is a lot of documentation. I was lucky enough to stumble across it. And so a way of honoring that artist, just to research, like, databases of killed by police.
Walking in the background.
Yeah.
I apologize. Sorry, go ahead.
I thought you said how. If anybody was wondering how.
My dog may have said how. No, please, I'm sorry for the interruption. This is fascinating. One, I have two just quick questions within there. One, did you figure out who was behind it, and have you been able to connect with them?
No, I haven't been able to connect with them, and I haven't figured out who was behind it, because for a while that he kind of went off the grid because he wasn't getting funding, and then I was like looking, I was like, where is he? And then I'm saying he because I'm assuming, I'm being very assumptuous.
I'm just biased.
Right now, but this person pretty much made another website, but there's no connection to who it is, at least from what I was seeing. And I was like, well, at least at the very least, if my work gets some traction, anytime I talk about No More hashtags, I'm always talking about that website, because that's where I got my information and where I got my motivation. So in hopes of putting it out in the universe, and this person comes and saying, hey, this was me. Like, thank you for using my work in the way that I anticipated it to some degree.
So what did some of those stories look like?
Some of them are kind of, so the whole website is kind of a little depressing when you start looking at the different stories, but there was one story of a portrait that I did of DeAndre Phillips, and he was in a police complex. His story, he was in a police complex. It smelled like marijuana, and police actually entered the car when they try to apprehend him for whatever reason. I'm not sure what the reason is, but they entered the car and end up shooting him. He fled the car and they end up shooting him in the back. Trevon Johnson, there's a couple of stories because that name is kind of popular, but one story in particular, and not to be confused with the Trevon Johnson who broke into someone's house and then was killed by police, but there was a Trevon Johnson, January of 2017, so around the time I was getting really excited about this work, who died on New Year's Day. Police was called to the house for a wellness check. And I realized a lot of these are surrounded by, police are called for wellness check and then person is found dead or ends up dead. And so this, he was 17, I believe. So he wasn't 18 yet. Family was really concerned. I guess there was some kind of family altercation where voices were being yelled and just emotions were just warring. And so police called specifically for a wellness check. To check on his mental health. There was some kind of scuffle. I think he had a knife and there was some kind of scuffle and they shot him dead. So those are the kind of stories. There's other stories of Native American women being hit by police cars, and then doing some further researches in that, and in some areas, especially when the pipeline situation was going and very popular, the Dakota pipeline. I learned, and I don't want to say the wrong state, so I'm just going to say it general, but I learned in some areas where there are Native Americans, if a police officer, if they're protesting and they're in the street, a police officer accidentally hits a pedestrian, they cannot be held reliable. And so there's like all these little things that are being compiled on this one website. And there's so many different avenues. Different artists can go, writers, and different people can go as it relates to the content. But like I said, I'm forever grateful for people like Oliver DuVernay and people like who create platforms just to educate other people. Because sometimes if you don't, well, not sometimes, all times, if you knew better, you would do better. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really trying to create a culture, at least for myself and the people around me. It's like, we have to do better. Mm-hmm. We obviously didn't know better, but we have to do better. And that's a priority for me.
Well, I think it's incredible that you're using your work to tell these stories. How do you translate something like that into your work, and still have these beautiful fabrics and rich colors? Like, how do you insert that messaging of such heaviness into the work? Still have
the patterns that I use, and if you see my work, they come in so many different kind of patterns, but all the colors are for the most part the same. So I use the Pan-African colors, the red, the gold, the black, the white, or not white, but like I do use white because it's a really awesome base color, and you need to, I'm thinking about my elements and principles of design. And then I go into the more patriotic colors because I am an American, right? With the red, white, and blue. And so you'll see those pretty much in all of my work, and there's some green in there. I think I forgot to say green, but you'll see that within all of my work. And that's the trend that I hope to unify my work. Mm-hmm. We're talking about African and American diaspora narratives, but even beyond that, the patterns that I make, I do a ton of research to come up with the type of patterns that I make in the backgrounds, and they have symbolic messages to them. And so that's another way for me to get in and say, actually, do you know that's an Ndinkra symbol? And that symbol stands for education. And this portrait relates to that because of this way and the other. The no more hashtags, the patterns that are in the background, those are actually, if you were to look through a 9mm through the barrel, that's the exact image you will see. Mm. And so, yeah, those little micro things that I've never seen. I've never had a gun pointed at me like directly, but I have friends who are gun owners, and I was like, hey, I need to see what this actually looks like so I can then put people in that position. And those are my favorite portraits to see people interact with, because people get it immediately. They're like, oh, that's a gun. And usually those people who have gun experience. And then people who don't pick that up, they've never seen a gun. And so I really like that exchange of energy and intellect. So all of my patterns have some kind of subliminal or hidden message in it. And sometimes you can pick it up really quickly, and other times you have to sit with it. And I encourage people to sit with my work. And so sometimes I make my patterns a little bit hard to read because I want people to sit with it and think about what they're actually seeing as it relates to them and themselves.
So at your exhibit, Fallacies of a Black Identity Enthusiast, that you had at a community college, you received some pushback.
Oh, yeah.
I read that there was a phone call, or at least a message. Somebody wasn't brave enough to come and say it to your face.
Yeah.
A voicemail kind of along the narrative of all lives matter.
Mm-hmm.
How do you respond to that? Do you respond to that?
I didn't respond to it. So I was featured on W22 or local news for Springfield, and they talked about a portrait that I did of my little brother that I painted on a flag, and I painted it on the flag as a way to protest his ideas about joining the military as it relates to him being a Black man outside of the military. And so she saw that and she was like, that's not right. It was like a 2-minute rant about how that's not right and how all lives matters. And there was a couple of things that were like just incorrect, period. It was just kind of funny. But I was here for it. People were like, oh my God, this person said this about your work. And I'm like, this is the kind of energy I want to see. I want people getting angry about my work, because I want to understand where their anger comes from, where their biases come from, so we can have a conversation about how can we further face these kind of issues without being triggered in the same way that we expect to be triggered in certain situations. I feel like, especially when we're talking about race, history, and privilege, a lot of people find trouble entering those spaces and being comfortable because they don't have the resources to be comfortable, feel safe in those situations. Although people of color obviously always have some kind of feeling of being uncomfortable because of systematically how things have been done, I think it's really important to just have empathy and just to share space with others who are, for lack of better words, expert in their story. I feel like everyone is an expert in their story, and we need more platforms to share each other's perspectives, as opposed to saying my perspective is better than everyone else's and you should listen to me. Versus there's a lot of room and growth for us to, Rachel, what is your story about when it comes to race, history, and privilege? Kiayani, what is your story when it comes to race, history, and privilege? You'll be very, very surprised how our stories overlap. And I think that's where the meat is where we overlap and where those commonalities are, because we're a lot more similar than we are different. I mean, for like, in all seriousness, a banana is like 99, like we share a lot of DNA with a banana. So who's to say we have limbs and we have mouths and we have hair? It's just the spectrum of what we are. And so what does that look like when we really break down those biases and those systematic issues that have us really separating ourselves by history, race, and privilege?
So you talked about your brother. Is he still in active service? He's a Marine, right?
Yes, my brother is a Marine. He entered when he was 17. So that goes back to me saying my mom would have sent us to clown school and found the best one if she thought that's what we wanted. That's something he's wanted to do from he was a little boy. But I also do remember him telling me he felt like that was his only way out of our socioeconomic situation. And to me, like, that made me really sad because I know how he's perceived as a Black man in this society. He had his high school girlfriend was a white girl, and her parents were so anti my little brother that it almost prevented him from actually being able to enlist, because the police got involved. There was just so much malice behind it. And so he's a sergeant now in the Marines, and he's looking to investigate. He just got accepted to be a U.S. Embassy guard. And so, like, I fear for him in the sense of when you're not in uniform and when you're out, you're not going to be looked at as a veteran. You're not going to be looked at as a hero. And so how can I help protect you? And so me making my work is like, hey, I'm doing this portrait of a Black man on a flag, and politically that has a lot to say about a lot of things. But in the grand scheme of things, he's only 21. And so when he's done and he lists, what is that going to mean for him in this society, especially with the political climate that's going on right now? It's very scary times. And especially in the art world, I guess I want to make space for other people to attach themselves to that narrative. So I was here for that negative, because I usually get really positive things and I want to hear the negative things. I want to hear what people are struggling with understanding, because I feel like that's why I'm here, is to help people. It's not about all lives mattering, right? As a Black man, he's always going to be looked at as a Black man. But Latino men, they have sometimes a privilege to be looked at as white men as opposed to Black men. But him serving for this country, I wanted to make a statement, not only for myself, but for him, to saying, you are not just what people portray you as.
It's just, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. But when I think about those that identify as patriotic, yet also are actively racist and judgmental, like how does somebody reckon with that? How do you as with a brother in active service and visually seeing a lot of this now, because these people that perhaps have been had these biases and they've been under a rock. All of a sudden, we have somebody in the White House who is emboldened them, right? They're out, they're loud, they're wearing their judgment and their racism on their sleeve like a badge of honor almost.
Mhm.
Like, how do you deal with that? How do you process that?
When I first started making the No More hashtag portraits and I was posting them on Instagram, I was getting a lot of like, why are you making portraits of these criminals? Like, they don't deserve for you to be making portraits of them. And like, part of that was, like I said before, is them not understanding what it is that I'm trying to do. And I know and this is why I have such passionate ideas in education, is because, and I've had people of non-color tell me this, you cannot go through our education system in America without informing some kind of biases. Our education system is very whitewashed in the sense of, I didn't learn about Black artists like Kiayani Douglas until I was in a master's program, until I can control my own education. And so that has a lot to say with so many other people out there, white, Black, Spanish, whatever you may have it, are not being educated to America's true fabric and history. The amount of people who don't know about the Tulsa riots and Black Wall Street. I mean, don't get me wrong, I didn't know until about 3 years ago about the Tulsa riots and Black Wall Street, but like, Black people at one point in time had extreme wealth in this country. And this was just years after the emancipation. And so we have that as a lost narrative. And so we have all these biases of people looking at people of color as not being worthy or not having generational wealth, because they don't know that that had been wiped out by people who, by white people who are literally angry for the fact that they had these freedoms and they were able to make money and things like that. This has happened all over. You talk about Rosewood in Florida. I remember as a little girl watching the movie, not understanding the movie Rosewood, but as an adult learning about it in my African American studies class and realizing, whoa, this was not that much different than the Tulsa race riots, but it was just in Rosewood, Florida. And so we have all these different pockets around the world of all these Black narratives, Native narratives, that are literally through time are getting lost. Before, I think as a society, we relied more on oral history to get our things. But now that we have phones, now that we have technology, I feel like oral history is getting lost more and more. And so as an artist, I try to position my work and myself as a way of holding on to oral history. So in a sense, you kind of have to know some oral history to understand some of the narratives that I'm trying to portray in my work. And so it's really, yeah, I think it's really hard to go through, to be an American and not form any biases. And that's Black Americans, that's white Americans, that's just Americans, period. Because when you, especially working in a boarding school where I have international students, it's really interesting how Black non-Americans think about race. They don't think about it in the same way as Black Americans think about race.
How so? In what?
Non-Black Americans, they don't, it's not, I guess there's not to say there's not a history throughout the world, but American history within race is so toxic and so heavy and so rich and so global that people globally, like for instance, people in Africa and people in the Caribbean, they look at America through a Western narrative. So they have no idea what it really means to be Black in America until they get here, until they sit here a little bit. So their views about Black Americans and race are sometimes different and not aligned with mine. And I think that's, I mean, there's a world diaspora that's happened with Africans. So of course there's going to be different ideas, but America being a first world country and being, like I said, I've had international students, because I teach at a boarding school, I had Asian students talking about lightening their skin in their yearbook photos. But I know where that's from. That's colorism, and colorism lives everywhere. But we don't realize it until me as a person working in this narrative and being an advisor of your book, I hear from a student of Asian descent saying, "Oh, miss, can you Photoshop and lighten my skin?" And I'm like, for what? But it's a real thing. And I know they hold these biases because in their countries, Western narrative is everything: blonde hair, blue eyes, lighter, fairer skin. I went to El Salvador and none of the ads look like a naturalist, a native El Salvadorian. But that just goes to show that global narrative of pushing out Western narrative. And it's not that people don't want to know another narrative, it's that because we're in like this capitalist society, this global capitalist society, that narrative is going to be the main narrative that's going to be pushed. And it's going back to your question, the artist's responsibility. I feel like the artist's responsibility is to call these things out when we see them. Like we're seeing unjust, like our healthcare workers right now are not being elevated and not being treated and not being supported in the best way that they're being, that they need to be supported. There's artists out there making work, trying to honor their narratives. And I feel like as artists, that's, especially in the times that we're in, we need to be more selfless and less selfish and really get that message out there.
You know, when you were talking about other people from other cultures coming into the States, I can kind of relate to that because, you know, I always had this vision growing up in the UK of what America represented. And, you know, it was new, it was fresh, it was opportunity, it was Hollywood, it was all this fabulous, shiny beauty. And then, you know, it took me a couple of years to really start to see that undercurrent that exists here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was jarring. It was pretty staggering to know that. But when you think about how recent really the civil rights movement was, this happened.
That's the scary part.
It's like this happened recently. This is recent history. This is not that long ago. And obviously the shockwaves and the current still is very much apparent in, you know, in many places, even here on the East Coast. How do you, as an educator, advocate, or what action do you think perhaps needs to be taken to make sure that these things are included in education? You know, I recall just a conversation recently with Lauren J. Reed, Native American artist. I had her on the show a couple of weeks ago. And she said, you know, there's just so much missing about like the Trail of Tears and all this rich history that doesn't look good, right? It's just left out. And it sounds like, you know, it's the same when it comes to Black history. Like as an educator in your position, do you think there's anything that you could possibly plan to do, or, you know, any voices that you could bring to the table that might be able to push for some change in that aspect?
I think right now, more than ever, there's a lot of room for change when we're talking about education and the climate of it. Now that we're doing online distant learning, there's another breadth of information to learn about what that looks like of being inclusive in education. But for me, luckily I have a lot of teacher friends of color, and we've been, even though we don't work at the same school, at one point in time we did, and we definitely stay connected. And I was actually talking to a really good friend of mine yesterday, because she's a director of multicultural affairs for her school. She works at a middle school boarding school. And she was telling me about hate speech policy that they wanted to have for the school. I mean, as simple as that. I feel like a lot of schools in general don't have policies around what language looks like for everyone. And when I say language, it's using derogatory terms that might be endearing in some communities and offensive in other communities. And so she specifically put the N-word. And I said, well, you can't just put the N-word, and because then you're gonna make people think that you just care about the N-word. You gotta just make it like just transparent and just say, hey, this means everything. And we were talking, and the gist of our conversation, it was like, if you're making policies, you now have to have some kind of educational component that goes with the policy. You can't just drop the policy in everyone's lap and say, this is a new policy, I want you to adhere to it, without people understanding the damage that can be done if you perpetuate that kind of language. Not just in a school context, but I've had, I live in Western Mass, and it hasn't been all roses for me as the only person of color in the area, or only couple of, because I'm here with my boyfriend. And so like, we stick out like a sore thumb, but I've been in places where things have been done, and I know it's been motivated by race, but I also know the people who are supporting them don't understand. They just literally don't understand what it looks like for you to be hanging out in your car and for a security guard to call or summons the police because they never seen you before, even though you have every right to be in that space. And then for that security guard superior to gaslight you and say, no, you didn't see what you saw. You didn't hear what you saw, even though you had actual documentation for it. So I feel like as far as education goes, educating kids is very important. But I'm sorry, there's a lot of education needing for us adults. And I feel like you're putting, especially in institutions, you're putting educators in a very powerful place. We kind of need to do some backtracking because there's a lot of educators that don't know what they're doing in this social climate right now. They don't even know how to, it's so backwards in the sense of these educators, they're a lot older, obviously, but they've been teaching for 30 years. 30 years ago, there were a lot of systematic issues, even still now, that doesn't preference people of color. And so now that independent schools and other schools are more integrating and becoming more integrated, it's really important, especially for private schools, to understand if you have to have people of color, if you want to have faculty of color, you have to do some education, because these people are not going to feel safe. They're not going to feel elevated. And at the end of the day, that's what equity is about. It's meeting everywhere where they need to be in order for them to be equal to everyone. And so that means somebody might not get something. Well, you have it all, right? Someone that has nothing. And so they need a couple of blocks so they can just see the playing field the same way you feel, you play it. And so like, as far as education goes, I feel like our system, like I mentioned before, you can't go through our education system without informing some biases or having some biases about race, history, or privilege. But I feel like a lot of the work needs to be done with the educators, because we're trusting our children are going to be sound and conscious people in the society when you have educators who have very deep-rooted biases that are extremely toxic and are just perpetuating this systemic narrative that has been going on in our country for so long. I mean, there was a point in time where people of color, they weren't allowed to read, right? And at the same time, white people, they were given books and they were given all these different things. So there's an advantage, right? There's that, like, and that's the same with generational wealth. Like there is, like, they've had a head start. And so throughout time, we've been trying, but I feel like they need to break down the education system as we know it and reformulate it. And that means adding everyone's story, not just his story, not just the white American story, because although that is very important, but it's important in context to that Black story, to that Native story, to that immigration story, to that Asian story. I mean, when you're talking about concentration camps, just globally, Jewish weren't the only people held in concentration camps throughout our history. We had Japanese in California, if I'm not mistaken, they were held in concentration camps for a while. And so, like, there's so much history, and I feel like a lot of people are like, well, do you want to be a socialist? Do you want to be a communist? Nothing. I think we can look at history and come up with new systems. And that's where the energy I come from. It's just like, I feel like as far as the education system, we need to look at it and we need to create new systems in order for it to work for everyone and in order for it to be inclusive for everyone. And so online distant learning, I'm kind of excited about, because I feel like it's one of those things, if we can get school systems, honestly, to put their money where it belongs, and the children, they're giving the children the resources that they need, especially in public schools. I'm very grateful that I can be an educator in private schools, but the real work, it needs to be done throughout the education system. But the nice thing about private schools is that we get to create our own curriculum, as opposed to teaching a curriculum that is kind of made for you. And so I really believe that we kind of need to just like pull the rug from underneath the education system and reevaluate it and see how it can be inclusive, because it's obviously not inclusive now.
I think we need to pull the rug on many of the systems as well. I agree with you. I mean, you think about an educator, it's really a position of power, right? You have the position to impact potentially so many lives at such a vulnerable and impressionable age. The same goes with, people in positions of power like police officers and prison guards. And, like you said, there's unconscious bias in positions like that just are damaging. deadly.
Yeah, that's, I think, the scariest part of where that lives and where a lot of my work or a lot of my advocacy comes from, is that, like you said, a lot of people in these very powerful positions have these biases. And that's the scariest part. There's a lot of people, and I've seen it in education, where the biases kind of bleed out of their eyes. And it's just, I feel for the child, because I know that on both sides, I mean, people kind of don't know better, right? And so the person who decided to omit the B word from when they're talking to middle school students, but say the word nigga, like they've obviously been taught throughout their life that word is okay, but the B word isn't. So where do we need to infiltrate that is like in the homes. And so like we need parents to be more sold and be willing to learn. So if we do revamp education, right, it obviously will hit the students first, but parents need to be more involved in their kids' education, asking them what they're learning. Because me as a 12-year-old and my father telling me about Black Panther Party and me immediately telling him he has no clue what he's talking about, that's a perfect example of what that education system is doing to our youth, and to everyone. It's misinforming and miseducating people. Because Black Panther Party was true. It was a party, but I just didn't understand the context of it in the sense my father was talking about, because whenever I heard about the Black Panther Party, it was always something bad.
And on that note, the Black Lives Matter organization was labeled as an extremist group by the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
You have an advocacy group, which is what Black Lives Matter is, right? Labeled as something so sinister and negative as a pretty much a terrorist organization.
Yep.
And you have these white supremacist, KKK, all of these just unbelievably horrendous groups that live in the middle of the country getting away with this rhetoric without any consequence. How do we even begin to come to the table when that's already an unconscious bias coming from one of the highest lawmakers in the land?
I didn't hear the question. I think
so how do we come together? How do we, get the communities to come together to have these conversations and to make progress when someone as authoritative as the FBI is labeling the advocacy group as a terrorist organization?
I'm so happy you asked that question, because I called my work Black Identity Enthusiasts, because I wanted to counter that narrative of Black identity extremists. And so that's what they're calling Black Lives Matter when it comes to terrorist groups. They're being called Black Identity Extremists. And there was recently, a couple years ago, a Black man who was very militant, kind of had the same similar energy of Black Panther Party. He was actually arrested and charged with the terror. It was just a whole big thing. But I called my work Black Identity Enthusiasts because I wanted to counter that narrative. And I feel like it's going to sound repetitive, but at the end of the day, I feel like education is going to be the root of everything. If people know about Black identity extremists, they will also know about Quenchable, which was the same thing, but that was being done during the times of Malcolm X, Black Panther Party, and Laura Coffey, Marcus Garvey, all these civil rights leaders and people who were advocating for Pan-African movements were all infiltrated from the FBI because they were looked at as terrorists. And this was 40, 50 years ago. And now we're in 2020 and we have the same thing with just a new name. So I say this to say, if we know our history, then we can't be fooled by narratives like this. But because we don't know our history and because our history is not given to us on a silver platter, we are going to be dubbed. People are not going to realize that Black Lives Matter is being treated like a terrorist group and not as an advocacy group. And that's where a lot of my work comes from, and a lot of my personal advocacy comes from, because I know that there's certain laws and certain systems that are being put into place for people like myself and people like Black Lives Matters not to be as successful. And I also think that's a reason why a lot of Black leaders are scared to lead, because they're scared to being infiltrated and being labeled as someone who's evil or someone who is an extremist, for lack of better words. And so that's why I labeled this body of work Black Identity Enthusiast, because I was like, no, because people ask me, they're like, oh, you're like, are you like anti anything? And I'm like, actually, I'm not anti anything. I'm pro-Black, obviously, but I'm not anti everything. And I am pro-Black because I understand that Black narratives are not in the forefront of the world. And so somebody needs to be, in order for other people to understand the importance of it. And so that's just where I kind of position myself when it comes to my art and my advocacy. But I think no matter which way you flip it, education has to come first, and we have to figure out a way how we can educate the masses. Even in the narrative of coronavirus, what's going on. People stay educated and know that they have to stay healthy. I feel like there could be a lot more positive conversations around certain things.
Well, Kay, I think absolutely full, and I think you're going to do incredible things, both as an educator, as an artist, just as a Black woman, as a creative.
I really appreciate it.
I'm excited to see what you do, and you're already making a big impact. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming to this conversation so candidly and openly today.
Yes.
I really appreciate it. And let's take a couple of questions or read a couple of these.
Oh, we have questions.
Yes. All right. So anyone else, any questions for Kate? Jump on in right now to the comments. Okay, so this is from Conception. It's obviously not from me because I'm sitting talking to you, but it says, we're grateful to you as well. I'm so proud of all you're doing.
Nice.
Jen says, I like how Kay said we can come up with new systems rather than using the labels that have been used before. Okay.
Yeah, that's really important. Just new systems. Obviously, old systems are not working.
Yeah. Jen, good to see you, Jen. Jen says, Ms. Douglas, you are an absolute grace and empowering force. Thank you as an educator for investing in our future. You make me excited and hopeful about our future.
Thank you.
Stacey Guria.
That's my mother, by the way.
Oh, hi, Mom. Good job, Mom. Kate, though her father and I was crazy, thought her father and I were crazy talking about Black Panthers.
Yeah, that's very true. I thought they were crazy.
Amazing. All right. Well, Kate, again, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. And, I look forward to just seeing what you do next. And, oh, one more comment. Hang on.
Oh.
Okay. I know times are weird. Is there another talk or presentation that you're giving that we can perhaps see?
Actually, I'm doing a talk tomorrow. And if you, with the University of Hartford, talking about my work and talking about how that relates to art therapy. And so if you have an Instagram, you can follow me on Instagram. That is I am K Douglas, IAMKAYDOUGLAS. There's an underscore in the beginning of that part. Or on Facebook at K Douglas. I will be sharing that video as I get permission and edit it. But my website, I am K Douglas, will have a flooding of interviews and other things that I've done. And also YouTube. You can always search my name on YouTube. And past talks that I've done are on my website and YouTube as well. Wonderful. Thank you for your interest.
Absolutely. And I've added your website to the to the YouTube and the Facebook comments as well. So if anybody wants to go ahead and look at Kay's work, find out what she's going to be doing next, that is your place to do it. Or obviously follow Kay on Instagram as well. Kay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel.
Absolutely. Come back and see us sometime soon.
Yes, we'll do. Take care. Thanks for everyone. Bye.